So the way I look at this podcast is kind of alongside the theme of the blog, which is an intelligent look at theme parks from the perspective of a fan. And I don't mean to be high and mighty here. I just am going to try and take a smart approach. I'm a big fan of themed entertainment and Disney parks especially, and it's easy to rave about them because they're amazing places. But there is a point where I try and take a little more of an intellectual look at the parks and talk to some interesting guests that have a cool background about it. That was me, Dan Heaton, back in the summer of 2015 on episode 1 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. We're here today for episode 100. This is going to be so much fun. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thank you so much for joining me here on episode 100 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. Way back in the summer of 2015, I recorded my introduction podcast that you heard a little bit of at the start. I sound a little sleepy the whole time. It's interesting to look back at where I started. Did some early interviews with Ryan Ritchie, Christian Moran, Seth Kubersky, Sam Genoway, so many cool guests right up front. Having a chance to talk to them really set the stage for where I am now. So I want to tell you what this episode is going to be. I don't have any guests this time. It's just going to be me talking, but I do have a lot to cover, so I hope that you enjoy this. I'm going to start by going back. I know a lot of you have not heard episode 1. I promise this won't be a repeat, but I want to talk about my history with theme parks and give a brief overview there and what got me interested, why I still love them so much. I want to talk about some shows that I'm really inspired by today and in the past that got me interested in Disney podcasts and then podcasts in general. I also am going to talk about how this podcast really got started, which I didn't talk about much, of course, on episode 1, how it's progressed over the years, where I thought it would go and where it's gone, and of course, where I want it to go in the future. And then finally, I had put the call out for a bunch of questions from you, the listeners, and many of you came through. I'm going to incorporate them throughout my description, ones that kind of fit. I want to talk about those. And then at the end, I'll talk about some of the other miscellaneous questions that you submitted. So there'll be a lot of different topics covered. I promise this is not just going to be all about me. There's a lot more to it than that, though that will be part of it, of course. But I definitely want to talk about some cool topics that people brought up and also just what I think about theme parks at this exact point and where it's going. There's a lot to cover here, but I think it's going to be really fun. I think this is a perfect time to take a brief pause and just be excited about the fact that this is the 100th episode of this podcast. When I started it, if you had said I was going to do 100 episodes, it would be like, wow, that would be a lot. And especially given just how much the pace has picked up in the past few years after a slower start. And I kind of want to pick up the pace more in the future. I got so many things I want to talk about, so many people I want to speak with. It's really excited. So let's dive right in to episode 100 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. Here we go. All right, let's start with my background. So I live in St. Louis, Missouri, and grew up here. So my parents, they like to travel. They travel a ton now. When we were younger, we would go on car trips every summer. My mom was a teacher, so it wasn't during the year. It would be when we were out of school in June. Each summer, there would be some sort of vacation that we would do. And they were often to Florida. And granted, when I was younger, Walt Disney World was not something you'd go to, at least for us, for like a week or two. What would be is we would go for a shorter time and then go spend a week at the beach. And we did that a lot of times. So it became pretty common where I know a lot of us have a very similar experience of, I'm the youngest of three. I have an older brother and older sister, and my parents would have the three of us in the back seat of, like a 70s-ish sedan, I guess probably from the 80s as I got a bit older. And the three of us would be in the back seat, and they would wake us up super early, like 5 or 6 in the morning. We'd get in the car because we wanted to get to our first stop on our road trip in like Georgia so we could swim at the pool. So we would long drive, very few stops, all the way to Georgia, and then the second day into Florida, either the beach first, sometimes just the beach, or to Walt Disney World. And of course, when I was really young, which I don't remember that well, it was just the Magic Kingdom. I do have a little bit of memories of staying at the Polynesian Resort, which was in 1980, and I was only 4 years old. And my memory is mostly we rode, I think, a golf cart, if I remember correctly, from our car, and they took us to where our room was. That's kind of a memory I have. And then I have a few from the pool, though we do have some old home movies of that might be coloring that. But I don't really remember that trip at all. The first one I really remember was in 1984. We went to Walt Disney World, Magic Kingdom, and EPCOT. I believe we had a 3-day pass, if I'm remembering correctly, where we did maybe even 4 days, if that was a thing that early. But it was the first time I'd ever been to Epcot Center. So I remember the first day, that's where we went. And, I've said this story before, so you may have heard it, but there was no internet, obviously. I don't even think I had really seen anything about the park, maybe a picture of Spaceship Earth, but I was only 8 at the time. And the first ride we did, we walked in, and of course we made the mistake of following the crowds and getting in line and waiting at the first attraction, which was Spaceship Earth. And I do have a really clear memory of you go up, and at the time they had these smoke machines, and it was more serious, and it was very like, you are traveling back to 30,000 years ago or something like that. And it was very serious. The Lawrence Dobkin narration, part of the script was written by Ray Bradbury. And I don't mean this in a negative way. I just remember going to that scene with the cavemen, and it was before, not how it is today. It was more how it is in the earlier versions. And I remember being like, this is freaking me out. I have no idea what this is. And of course, as the ride goes along, you're seeing there's brighter scenes, you have the Renaissance and everything else. And it's not the same. But those early scenes, I just remember being freaked out. But I was also fascinated by it. We did so much during that trip. And of course, you had other attractions like Horizons, Journey to Imagination, World of Motion. And I remember that trip really well. But I think it rolls in together with other trips we did. I know we went, I believe, in 86 and 87. And then we went in 89 for the first year of Disney MGM Studios. I have a few pictures and clips from that where it was just so empty, which is weird. I'm not saying it wasn't successful. It was just Walt Disney World was so different. But we went into the early 90s. So to summarize, I basically spent a lot of time going there as a kid. It became just kind of part of what we did on a lot of summers. One summer we went to California when I was 9 in 1985. That was the first time I remember being on an airplane. We spent a couple days at Disneyland. So we didn't always go to the parks every year, but at least, every other year or maybe 2 out of 3 or whatnot through most of my childhood. And they call this kind of the Disney gene with people, where it's not like I would say I have that in terms of all the movies and everything. Yes, I know the movies pretty well, and obviously we know the music and all of that, but I was always more of a parks person where I love the rides, and I love that. I love all the immersion of it and how well the parks are done, but it wasn't just because if someone ever said, are you a Disney fan? I'd say, Partially, but I don't want it to seem like, I don't own shirts with Mickey Mouse on them or anything. It's more about the parks and the attractions, and that's always been the draw for me. Beyond that, through other amusement parks, Universal, regional parks, so much more. But I went as a kid a lot, but I had a stretch of time in college, and then we went once in 1998, which I did not know at the time was such a big deal because I rode Horizons and Journeyed into Imagination and so many things before they closed, but then I didn't go again until 2005. So there was a big stretch where I wasn't as into it. And one of the ways I got back into it was just through the internet starting, and they're starting to build up an internet community. I wasn't really that involved in the Disney community on the early days, but I did start listening to podcasts. And so for me, I had a stretch where I was still into the parks, but I didn't go for a long time. It's interesting to me that it really took an interest in writing. My background, I went to school, University of Missouri, for journalism. And so I would write a lot about movies. I wrote blogs. I wrote for some DVD sites when DVDs were really big. So I kept doing that writing and then got really into podcasts. At the start, more movie podcasts. Like there's a podcast called Film Spotting that was one of the first big podcasts that I listened to all the time. And getting into blogs, writing, and everything else, and having that background. When I was in college, I also did a college radio show, which was like indie rock music and all of that, but still was doing this kind of talking. I had a shift one year from 2 to 6 in the morning where I swear nobody listened, and yet still I enjoyed it. It was fun to me. I was never really that nervous about it. So all those things kind of played in to what ultimately got me to the point when I thought, I want to start a site about Disney. And then from there, kind of morphed into also a podcast, and still never would have expected that it would get to the point where it is right now. Now seems like a good time to get to the first listener question. This one comes from Jim Caserta. Did something in particular trigger a change from casual fan to someone who has their own blog and podcast? Or what is the journey like from casual fan to having a blog and podcast? So I don't know if I've ever called myself really a casual fan. I guess there was that point during the early 2000s when I wasn't going to the parks. But even then, having gone so much when I was younger, it was always just sort of there, that Disney gene idea. So when I dove back in, I was already full on. So I don't know if I really would say casual fan. I would say there was an evolution in terms of going from someone who was a fan of the parks but wasn't creating things like blogs or podcasts into that zone. So I think it really started. So I mentioned earlier that I went to journalism school at University of Missouri, and when I found jobs, there was some writing, but again, it was more corporate and business and not the same way. So I was looking for ways to write, and for a long time, I wrote various movie reviews for sites and things like that. Ultimately, I decided I wanted to start my own site. So I started a blog called Public Transportation Snob, which was named based on a quote from a movie I really like called Metropolitan by Whit Stillman. The goal there was to write about movies and a little bit of TV, and it's still there at ptsnob.com. And I wrote a lot from like 2011 through 2015. And since then, I really don't do much with it now. I will sometimes put in updates, but they're usually things relating to what I'm doing on the Tomorrow Society. But I did hundreds of reviews, wrote a bunch of essays, and really enjoyed doing it. But there was a point where I started to lose a bit of interest in it. So another thing, too, when I was writing for that site is I would periodically write about theme parks or about Disney movies. I started to get more interested in doing that as it went along. So when the site seemed to have run its course and I wasn't as interested, it seemed to make sense that I would start a blog focused on theme parks in the industry, because I was getting more interested in writing about that and less doing reviews of movies, which I'd done for so long. But writing for that site and doing so much writing, I think I became a better writer as I went along. So all of those essays and reviews of movies made a huge difference and also got me more into writing regularly and posting regularly, which is what you have to do when you have a blog. Another thing, too, is that I also was making some guest appearances on film podcasts. And they were usually just friends who did blogs online similar to me. There was one podcast called The Lambcast, which was a bunch of film bloggers and people on those sites could get together. It'd be 5 or 6 people, and we'd just have fun and talk about movies and play different games. But all of that made me more comfortable doing podcasts. So when I ultimately wanted to start a podcast, I already had some history there. Another thing, like I mentioned recently when I talked with Jessica Leese, is that she had asked me to be her co-host on a podcast about The Amazing Race Canada, which started in the summer of 2015, around the same time, a little bit before that I started doing the Tomorrow Society podcast. So doing that, where you recapped a reality show every week, and we've been doing that for the past 5 years, to me is a lot more challenging than doing an interview or doing things about theme parks. One, because you're reacting directly to something that's happening that week. You don't have a lot of times to process. It could be you watched it that day or the day before. So to me, that was a real challenge, but it made me more interested in doing other types of podcasts, and also made me think I could do a regular show and still keep up with it. So all of that really led to me deciding to do the Tomorrow Society podcast. So I wouldn't say it was a moment. I think it was more of a gradual progression going back to journalism school, through the writing about movies and TV, and then ultimately leading to wanting to do a podcast. Another big element that I referenced earlier is other podcasts, because I had been an early adopter of podcasts and such a fan going back to the fairly early or mid 2000s when podcasts were just getting started. You know, you had an iPod that you would hook up to your computer and then download specific shows, and it was not like today with apps and everything and made it so easy. But there were shows that really made a difference in, one, getting me interested in podcasts, but two, also reigniting my fandom in Disney. And the biggest one from the start was Inside the Magic. I felt like Ricky Briganti did such a good job of really expressing his fandom and making a show that was fun. He would come in every week. Regardless of what was happening with Disney, he had interesting topics. He ultimately brought on Skipper Ben, who also was just on my show. And what I enjoyed about that is it made me think, there's a community here, and started to build up around his show. There are a lot of people like me who are adults, maybe don't have kids, which I didn't at the time, and are still really into the parks. And Ricky was a perfect example of that and did a good job also with production of his show, incorporating a lot of music. And it was just a fun show. When I talked to Ricky on this podcast, I'm not sure I've been as starstruck with most other guests, just because I had heard him for so long on the podcast when Inside the Magic had their show. And so to actually talk to him about that and then about his decision to sell it was also one of the most interesting interviews for me with a podcaster, because he had found a lot of success and then ultimately decided to walk away. But going back to some other shows, another big one, of course, was Lou Mangello, who started out with Mouse Tunes and then went on to WDW Radio. And at that time, he was really focused on history and trivia, and he still is now, but it was a completely different situation. He hadn't even moved to Florida yet. And also, too, Ricky and Lou both did such a good job with the production. Lou, especially when he went on to WDW Radio, choosing that name Radio, it was like a high quality show. And at that time, there were a lot of podcasts that were not on that level. The care he put into it is something that, and I am not putting together sound effects and music on any level comparing myself to Lou, but I always found when I wanted to do a show, I wanted it to sound good, or as much as I could, and not thrown together. And I try to focus on that when editing. And so that was inspired a lot by what Lou was doing in those early days. And he was such a fan too. There's a reason he's had so much success, regardless now of kind of what you think about it. He was such a fan, and you could feel that same with Ricky. Speaking of fans, WDW Today, the original version, was another one that again kind of gave me that idea. These are regular guys that all really love the parks. Of course, you had Len Testo, who I've talked with and is still very prominent, Matt Hotchberg, and Mike Newell and Mike Scopa. And it was just fun. I never was on the level of recording the audio clips behind a tree like Mike Newell did, or staying at Pop Century for weeks like Mike Scopa. Scopa Towers. But really, what I loved is they did short shows. They knew the parks. They had guests that I really enjoyed too that would come in here and there, like AJ Wolf, the Disney Food Blog. And just the way that they put together their show, I found so interesting, and they were just fun guys to hang out with. It felt like you were hanging out with friends that really liked the parks. I want to mention a few more. One is the Season Pass podcast, which is still going, not as much today, but that to me was really big in terms of they did interviews with so many interesting guests. They had people like Tony Baxter, who's been on a lot, or Joe Rohde, or other bigwigs, but they also talked with people that I didn't know anything about, like Jerry Rees or Bob Rogers or Peter Rummel, people that were super important to Disney's growth, but were not names that you often heard about, and many of them that might have their own companies, like someone like Garner Holt, that have also played such a huge role in what's happening at theme parks. And Doug and Brent and Robert also would go way beyond just Disney, and they would talk about Six Flags and Cedar Fair and other regional parks, which I found so interesting because I didn't know as much about them, but I wanted to. And that was a big deal because I felt like those guys who were somewhat involved in the industry, Brent works at Super 78, but also just had a lot of interest in the industry itself beyond just talking about Disney. And to me, that was important. And they also just seemed like pretty normal people. They weren't like ones who were going to Disney World every week or something. They were more like me. They were fans, but also just really interested in kind of how things worked. And I love the interview format. Finally, I want to mention the Diz Unplugged. Again, that original group, Pete Werner is one of the best hosts of podcasts in the Disney community. He's very outspoken, but he also has a way where he can rein in a group of 5 or 6 people in a week, make a conversation flow, and really lead it and have passionate opinions, and just is really good at boiling an issue down to its essence. You can really tell the difference, with no offense to anyone else, when Pete doesn't host that show. But the early days of that show, when you had Bob Varley and Corey and Julie and Kevin and John and Pete, that original group was just so strong. And they've had good people come in left and right, but I just really connected with them, especially when the internet, Twitter wasn't a thing. The internet didn't have news like you have now. I really, for a while, relied on them to talk about news. Now it's very different, but that original group really inspired me to be interested in podcasts. So that really was just kind of the road that led me up to actually doing the Tomorrow Society podcast. I was interested in other shows, which when I was developing the podcast, things like interview shows, you had Mark Maron did a really good show that he's had for so long, Terry Gross and Fresh Air, the long form podcast. These are kind of shows that even now I'm still really interested in how they do interviews. Jesse Thorne, who does Bullseye and also did a really cool show more recently called The Turnaround, has a really laid back interview style that I appreciate and would like to do more of in the future. So shows like that, that's kind of when I was creating the podcast. I was looking as much to shows outside the Disney community, which for better or worse, there's a reason maybe that, my show might be different, and I don't mean that in a good or bad way, but I've always tried to do something that maybe wasn't the same, partially, like I've mentioned before, because I'm not in Orlando or Anaheim. I think it was kind of a requirement, but also those are the types of shows that interest me. I don't just listen to Disney podcasts. I listen to a lot of them. So that was a really long-winded answer to Jim's question, but I hope that really got at kind of the progression and where it's gone and what ultimately led to creating the Tomorrow Society podcast, which I'm going to talk about now, the kind of early days of that, and how I put everything together, and then dig into some broader questions that are about more than just what I was doing. So the next step was really deciding I'm going to do the podcast, and it kind of went backwards, where actually I had done a blog review of After the Fair by Ryan Ritchie, which is an awesome documentary about the World's Fair in 1964 and 65 in New York. And so I had reached out to him. I did a review, and he's like, well, do you want to talk about the movie? And I was like, sure. I was thinking I could do like an email interview or something. He's like, well, let's just record it. Okay. So I recorded it and then had an idea it might be a podcast, but I had to look back at some emails back and forth. And I even have an email where I'm saying, well, I submitted it to iTunes to try and get a few more listens. I didn't have a really clear gauge on, okay, this is going to be a long-term podcast when I talk with them. But I thought, okay, I'll reach out to a few more people I like. Maybe this is something that I can do. So I reached out to Christian Moran and then to Sam Genoway, and both of them were excited to be on, talked to Seth Kubersky and a few others. And I was like, this could really actually work. So as I went along, I kind of figured out, well, what am I doing with this podcast? What is this going to be? So up front, I had kind of a long-winded explanation that it was intelligent discussion from a fan's perspective. And it got a little wordy. I think I changed it to smart discussion, but I've kind of summarized it and just be like, as I've gone along, to say, I talk to smart people about theme parks. And I feel like that summarizes it for the most part. Yeah, there's a few times when it's been mostly just about Disney or movies or whatnot, but you get the general idea. You could break it out and say, I talk to smart people about Disney, Walt Disney World, Disneyland, Universal, and other theme parks, blah, blah, blah. But try to keep it really simple. I'm just like, I just want to talk to smart people that I find interesting. And that's kind of the way it was from the start, where I was mostly focused in the beginning on authors and filmmakers. Eventually kind of expanded it to podcasters, especially when I talked to Len Testa, who technically is an author, but started thinking more in terms of who are people I can talk with that are interesting on podcasts, like Matt Parrish or Tim Grassi, or people that I really enjoy on shows, Hal Bowers, others. And then eventually got to a point where I thought, well, maybe I could do more behind the scenes people, but I'm jumping a little bit ahead. I want to go to this question kind of early on. The first so many episodes, I did not have a theme song, though I did add it pretty quickly, which was with the Seth Kubersky podcast, which I'm going to play a clip of how I use the theme song at the beginning for that episode number 5 with Seth Kubersky. And I cringe listening to this. I'm just going to play it just so you can hear it and really realize how far this has come. So here is how I first used the music of the Tomorrow Society podcast for my episode with Seth Kubersky back in 2015. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. I'm your host, Dan Heaton, and today's guest is Seth Kubersky, who is the author of The Unofficial Guide to Universal Orlando. He's also a blogger for touringplans.com and Orlando Weekly, and has written other books, been involved with books on Disneyland and Universal, of course, and other parks in Orlando. And our topic today is Universal Orlando, what they're currently doing, where they're heading, how their approach differs from what Disney is doing, and just how both companies are fighting so hard to draw guests in Orlando. It's such an interesting time for the industry, and I think Seth was a perfect person to talk to learn more from his perspective, being on the ground in Orlando, about what's going on and what could be going on in the future. So I hope you like the conversation. It'll start in just a moment. So hearing that music does lead me to my next listener question, which comes from Christopher Poltz, who sent this over email, sent several good questions. He asks, who are the Sophisticated Babies and Adam Hookey, and how did they get involved with the podcast music? Can you share any background on how you came up with the theme? Okay, so Adam Hookey is my brother-in-law. He is my wife's brother. He is a full-time musician. He's a trumpet player. He plays in bands all around St. Louis. He's released some albums. If you like jazz music, you should definitely check out the band Funky Butt Brass Band. They have a bunch of albums out there that are really easy to find. He also did his own solo album. Really talented guy who could create a lot of different types of music. It's his full-time job. It's what he does. So when I wanted to create a theme for the podcast, obviously I'm not going to use any copyrighted music that Disney has done. So I wanted something though that had a similar vibe. So I sent Adam, he was kind enough to do it. So I sent him several clips. One was the Interventions area loop background music. Another was aquaculture, a few other similar audio clips, and said, I'd like something like this, but I'm not sure exactly what it is because I'm not really musically inclined. And very quickly, Adam sent me back a clip that was too long, but was great. I mean, it sounded perfect. Exactly the vibe I wanted. The drum part, I still love. And ultimately, I figured out a way where I could the drums became kind of when it jumps in, which originally the song, as you heard in that clip from Seth, it starts out a little more ethereally and kind of quietly, which is perfect for EPCOT, but doesn't work great to start a podcast. So I found the point where I could really jump in was the da-da-da, and then going from there. But I really enjoy what he did, and it helps to have someone and the Sophisticated Babies is the name of a band that he does with one other friend of his who also plays a horn. And so they actually play together sometimes like on ukuleles. They'll do little parts in their shows. But I feel like that's kind of the moniker that he's gone under in a lot of different ways when he creates music. So it seemed to fit perfectly where technically he is the writer and the performer, but that's the band that he goes by when he's creating music like this, kind of more on a different one-off basis. So I hope that gives you a little bit of background. I did have someone reach out to me once and ask me like where in EPCOT that music was from, like where it came from. And I had to be like, actually and they also complained. They said that it was hard to hear and too fuzzy. And why didn't I get a cleaner version of it from the parks? And I explained that, well, I actually wanted it this way. I wanted it to feel like music from the 80s or older music, and also something that kind of, I don't know. Originally, I was especially looking more even in the past, but I wanted that idea that this was kind of a little bit looking backward, but kind of that old Epcot Center feeling to it. So I didn't mind if it wasn't entirely clear. This isn't a professionally produced song that was put together in a studio. It's one person who's a musician and very talented, but did on his own as a favor. So I think it's funny that I've gotten that question before that's asked for it. So it's time for another question here. This one is from David Patchell. David has sent me multiple emails about various episodes, and I really appreciate all the input, David. His question is, how do you go about choosing your guests for each episode? So I think it's kind of changed over the years. Early on, like I mentioned, I was still figuring out what I wanted the podcast to be, how often I wanted to do it. That's the thing with the show, is that it started kind of slow. I was just kind of doing interviews when I could. My girls were a bit younger, so it was a little harder to find time. So I would just I'd read a book by someone or watch a film, like I mentioned with Ryan Ritchie, or Christian Moran had a film also, or just something would strike my fancy and I think, well, that person could be interesting, or I like listening to them. Maybe they'd want to talk. But it was very kind of spur of the moment in a way, or I'd reach out. As it went along, I started to take a longer view of what are the types of people that interest me and expand it. Because I started out with authors and filmmakers and then was doing more podcasters, and then started to think about, well, what are some of the other types of people that I like to talk with? Well, I know someone like AJ Wolf does the Disney food blog, and I've heard her on shows years ago. Shannon Albert, we talked a lot about the business of running it. I found that really interesting. So I started to expand it and then moved on to composers and then Imagineers. Instead of just kind of rattling off the history, to answer the question, I like to have a bit of a variety in terms of the types of guests, but a lot of it is just what I'm interested in and whether I think they're going to be interesting. And I don't mean there's not a hugely high bar here. Sometimes I've taken chances where I don't know. I've never heard someone on a podcast or even seen a video clip of them. And I just think, but they wrote this interesting article or something, or they worked on an attraction that I found interesting. And I found that I've been surprised almost all the time by guests. Now, in terms of choosing them, a lot of it too is on availability, because when you're doing a podcast, the amount of people I reach out to is a lot more than the amount that will do the show. And a variety of reasons. Some, if they work for Disney or have any involvement there, they're not rarely going to be interested. Others, it's just they have a busy schedule, or they just don't really do podcasts, or sometimes it can take a really long time to schedule. So a lot of it can just depend on as simple as if you catch someone at the right time, where I reach out to someone who I find interesting and then they're available that week, or they're not available for a while. And so I think the main thing in terms of how I select guests, I don't want to make it too complicated. It really comes down to if I think their story is interesting, or if they have been involved in a project like an attraction or something they've created that I find really interesting. Because usually that goes together. Even sometimes I know a lot about a guest, like I've been listening to them for years on a podcast, or they've worked on 10 attractions I enjoy. Other times it's thinner. I think about Paul Leonard Morgan, who wrote the score for Test Track. That's really all I knew when I reached out. But as I looked more into his background, and he had done scores for movies like Dread and Limitless, and then had worked with bands that I like Belle and Sebastian, had a lot more interesting things. So sometimes it can just be they worked on one thing, and it can expand, where I feel like everybody has always done more things or been more interesting than maybe I would have expected. So on a related note, Brian Fisher on Facebook asked, "What keeps you doing the podcast?" I'm grateful for it. Well, thanks, Brian. It's funny because I think that even though the show has been going on for almost 5 years, coming up this summer, the frequency has increased a lot. So early on, I was doing a fairly small number of episodes per year. So it's not a case where I feel like, I haven't been doing episodes every other week for 5 years. But if you think about it, when I started doing the podcast on a bi-weekly basis, every other week at least, sometimes more, was in July 2018. At that point, when I did the episode about Toy Story Land, it was only episode 46 in July of 2018. So now I'm at 100, and it hasn't even been 2 years later. So when I picked up the frequency, I almost think of that around that time as really when the podcast got rolling, where I started kind of getting more ambitious with the guests I was looking for, and also just getting more frequent with my episodes means you're going to have to cast a wider net in terms of the people you talk with, which can lead to really big surprises. So for me, I feel like I've really only been doing the show long-term for about 1.5 years, where it's really become something that I'm working on every week. Most days I'm doing something, whether it's sending an email about a show, editing a clip, recording something like this. There's always something to be done. And especially given when I started up the Patreon in December 2018, because then I was doing extra episodes, the monthly Tomorrow Society Bulletin. And so there was a lot more that I was doing. So in terms to directly more answer your question, Brian, I think what keeps it going is mainly the fact that people are listening. I'm not saying it's a gigantic number, but when I hear from some of you that submitted questions, or the fact that some people have signed up as members on Patreon, I appreciate that so much. So that keeps me going. And then the second fact is just getting to talk to interesting people, because really what excites me more than downloads or anything else is I'm doing this. This is not my full-time job. I'm doing this as a fun thing, as a passion project. So when I get to talk to someone really interesting, when I talk to Tom Morris or talk to Peggy Ferris or an Imagineer that did something really cool, or even just a fellow podcaster that I really enjoy talking with, that is going to keep me going more than anything else. If I was ever doing these episodes and they felt like work, or they felt boring or painful, I wouldn't do them. But I can't think of any interviews that I've done the whole time where I was sitting there and was not engaged and excited. I come out of each one like, wow, that was the best one. Everybody brings more than I expect. I come in with a bunch of questions. People always blow me out of the water with answers, and that's been consistent since the very first episodes I did, and is still the case now, and I think is just going to continue as I move forward. So kind of keeping with the narrative part of it, I'm kind of going to shift just to questions here. But basically, to finish off the story, essentially, I'll talk in a minute about some of the big marker episodes that I feel like really changed it for me. But as much, I feel like I'm always evolving and getting better at it. And that goes along with talking to people that challenge me, that I get really nervous talking with. Like my next episode, 101, is going to be with Brand Farron, who did TED Talks and hangs out with people like Michael Eisner and was friends with Jim Henson and all this stuff. And I'm not saying that to brag. I mean, just I'm on that talking to this guy thinking, wow, this guy is a smart dude who's a big thinker, and he's taking an hour of his time to talk to me on this podcast, and I need to be up to that level. I need to not ask a dumb question. So that also drives me too, is the idea that I want to be good at this because someone is taking their time of their super busy schedule to talk with me. I want to make it worth it for them. I want to do the research to make it good and not just make them think, well, that was a waste or that wasn't fun. I want it to be fun for them beyond the publishing and the going out to audiences and all that, just that conversation. And it's a challenge sometimes, but I feel like that's what I've been working on more as much is just making it a fun experience for them, because if we're not having fun, you're not going to enjoy it. It has to convey that way. And I mean that in an organic way, not I'm trying to make it fake, just we're enjoying it. So then you might enjoy it that direction. So now I want to dig in next to the remainder of the questions. Instead of me just kind of going narrative wise, I'm going to dig into questions and jump around a bit because I want to stop talking just about the podcast and really dig into a few questions that I enjoyed, which were related to some other Disney parks things and kind of fun things. So I'm going to dig into these now. I will circle back to a few more questions more specifically about the podcast before the end. I just want to mix this up a bit and really dive into some fun questions that I am really excited to answer. Let's do one more question here from David Patchell. What non-Disney parks are you hoping to one day visit? David, it's a very long list, I will say. I'm going to try and summarize it the best I can into kind of different categories. First of all, there's a few I'd want to get back to that I haven't been to since I was a kid, which is Universal Studios Hollywood, which I went to when I was 9, did the studio tour. It was a very different experience at that time than what it is right now, obviously. The other one in California is Knott's Berry Farm, which again, I visited on that same trip, but I know it's changed so much. I really want to see the updated versions of the log ride and the mine ride. It looks so cool. I love what they've done there. It reminds me a lot of Silver Dollar City, which is near me. I also want to go to Dollywood, which I haven't been to before. I love what Herschend does at Silver Dollar City. I know it's very similar, and there are some coasters there that I really want to do for sure. Another one that I want to go to is Cedar Point, which I haven't been to before. I don't know if I'll be able to handle some of those coasters. I think about, when I went to Six Flags St. Louis, I had a day where I just went and did all the coasters basically, and I did not feel good afterwards. And those coasters are not on the same level as Cedar Point. Part of the issue might have been there was absolutely no line at all. So when you have a case where you're doing 4 or 5 coasters in the span of like 40 minutes, that's not really great for the body, especially when you're in your 40s. So I think I would have to go and just do a smaller amount. Like, okay, I want to do Maverick and Millennium Force and a few others and not try to do every single coaster. Like, could I really do Top Thrill Dragster and not feel terrible afterwards? I'm not sure, but that's a big one for me. There's a lot of regional parks that I haven't been to that I would love to get to. King's Dominion and Kings Island, of course, Kennywood, Knoebels, Carowinds, a lot on the East Coast. Even some of the Six Flags parks like Six Flags Over Georgia and Great Adventure, there's some that look really cool. Like I would love to ride El Toro at some point, and individual coasters that I haven't ridden that I'd really want to get to. I mentioned Kennywood. I actually had a chance to go there. I was in that area near Pittsburgh for a work trip, had one afternoon, basically from like 3 to 7, they were open, and there was a storm and they closed, which was really unfortunate because it would have just been me, and I doubt it would have been super crowded given the time of year. It was near the end of their operating year, and it would have been awesome to be able to ride all the coasters there and see that park. Beyond that, overseas, beyond the Disney parks, I really would love to go to Efteling. I don't know if there's any chance in the near future that we would actually get to Holland, get to go there, but the dark rides from that park just look insane. I think it's one of those parks that stands out if you just say pick a park beyond Tokyo Disney Sea that you would want to go to that's not in the United States. It would be really high for me. And of course, some of the British parks like Alton Towers and Thorpe Park look really cool too. I think this is more of a kind of bucket list, what would you love to see at some point kind of thing. But the chances of going to all of these is fairly low. I mean, I think of something like Cedar Point and Kings Island. They're in Ohio and not that far away, or even I suspect I will get to Knott's Berry Farm and Universal Hollywood. When you get beyond that and you're kind of looking all over the country and the world, it might be a bit lower, but still, I'm super excited to go to all of these, also Busch Gardens, Williamsburg, which I went to as a kid. I would love to get back there because they've done a lot of interesting things. And actually Busch Gardens Tampa, which I haven't been to in a long time. They've added a lot of coasters and some nice themed areas there. So what this is revealing is I have a lot of things to do and a lot of places to go, and I can't wait to get to all of these at some point, especially as my daughters get a little older. I'm hoping we could go to some of the parks that have coasters and maybe ride more of them and just kind of get to see more of what's out there beyond just Walt Disney World and a few other places. I also wanted to briefly mention one other question that David had, which is, have you ever or do you currently have aspirations to live closer to a Disney park or be employed by Disney? Currently, no. I think we're really well entrenched in St. Louis. My girls go to school here. This is where I'm from. Both my wife and I's parents are in the area. And I like St. Louis. There's still a ton to do here. I think it mixes well kind of the city aspects, but also still is reasonable to live in, has kind of that small town feel. It's kind of an interesting mix there. And having grown up, I'm so used to it. So I don't plan on moving to Orlando or Anaheim, at least any time that I can think of in the future. To answer in the past, I still kick myself that I didn't do the Disney College program because I think it would have been a really great experience. That would have been in the mid to late 90s when I was in college. And so that's something I wish I had done. I have a feeling if I had done it, it might have changed a lot of things in life. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I love the way my life went. So it's one of those things where it's like a sliding doors thing, where if I had done it, would I have ended up trying to work there and stay there? Possibly. When I was young, just out of college, I definitely looked into applying for various jobs at Disney. Nothing really came that worked out. Again, maybe if I had gone down there, it would have been different. But I'm okay with how things are. I love going to the parks, but I'm not somebody who's just really like, oh my gosh, I really wish I could live right there. I would love to go more often to parks, and I hope to do that in the next few years and beyond, especially once things have hopefully gotten better from the coronavirus, though I suspect it's going to be longer than any of us would like. But I would love to go to the parks more, and like I mentioned in the last question, really get to more parks around the country when I can. And that's probably the bigger thing rather than trying to make it a full-time thing. All right. Well, this is one that I'm really excited to answer. I have not answered one from him yet. This is from Jason Zambricki, who sent this from Wilkes Barre, Scranton, Pennsylvania. Thanks, Jason, for sending the email. So here's the question. So you and I are both big fans of classic Epcot Center. We all know Future World is undergoing a much-needed reimagining. If you were given the keys to the kingdom and an unlimited budget, what would your reimagined Future World look like? Okay, when I heard this, the light bulb went on. I'm going to do a full podcast in the future. Depending on how guests go, it may be in May or a little bit beyond. I'm going to do a full podcast on this topic because I feel like this is a great topic. I would love to dig into it and really go pavilion by pavilion and really do it. So I'm going to give a summary here that probably will still be fairly long, but just think about it. This is just kind of a starting point for what I want to talk about in that. So thank you, Jason. This is a cool podcast topic that I'm excited to do, especially with so much time at home and not being able to go to the parks. This is the perfect time to dig into this. So first of all, I think there do need to be some constraints, because if I think of it in terms of unlimited budget, you could go so overboard that it becomes like playing Roller Coaster Tycoon or something and using cheat codes where you're just making these ridiculous coasters and ridiculous everything and not thinking about the money. So I kind of like to look at it as, yes, I have a huge budget. I'm not going to set the exact amount, but I want to stay kind of down to earth and really look at, in Future World, what each pavilion brings now and what changes could be. And some of them could be fairly modest. I do have one kind of big thing that I would put in, but I'm going to look at where Future World is right now. So you've already got things under construction, different things, but I'm right away, I'm throwing out the World Celebration, World Discovery, World Nature idea. I don't mind it, and I'm curious to see what will happen, though I suspect it's going to get scaled back considerably. But I was curious when they announced it at D23. I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting approach, and I could talk for a half hour about what I think about that. So just thinking in terms of Future World, but Future World as it is kind of now. So let's start with Spaceship Earth. I think Spaceship Earth needs to be redone. But what I would love to do is almost take it like, what they did when they restarted the Carousel of Progress in 93. And I'm not talking about the laser discs or some of those things. What I mean, though, is they called it Walt Disney's Carousel of Progress. It was almost like a tribute edition where mostly, with the exception of the last scene, it was really still looking back to the original version. They brought back in Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow. They added new things with the last scene at the time, but it still had a lot of, even with its pre-show, with the video they show of Walt singing with the Sherman Brothers, had a lot of looking back in a way. And that's the way I'd like to look at Spaceship Earth. And I don't just mean it's totally that way. This isn't like when they brought back Captain EO, but sort of a tribute edition to the entire run of Spaceship Earth, and then adding a few new effects and new things to still make it seem new. So what I would love to do, first of all, I think we need to find a way to get the space station back out of being covered up in the planetarium zone. You can do some updates with projection mapping and images to make it more impressive, but you use that physical set. And because to me, that was always the coolest thing, is you get up into that planetarium and you essentially look back and there's this giant station, you got astronauts, there's more going on the screen. It's not just the Earth going by. And I feel like they took a step backwards when they covered that. And so I would love to right away add those physical sets back in, but improve them and also improve what we're seeing on the screen with projection mapping or just with the highest tech images you could possibly do. There have definitely been a lot of improvements since 2007 and what they can do with the Earth and stars and everything going up there. Another thing was the descent. I would like them to also bring back the sets there, but also make them better. So you already have, from what I understand, the animatronics and sets are still in place. You could use that as a starting point, but obviously you have the kids on the screen. You could do totally different things with that screen right off the bat. You could do a lot more things even with adding some animatronics or upgrading them, but you have that space with things already put in place that you wouldn't have to start from scratch and create entirely new scenes. You could do something there that would also be impressive. Another thing I would do is reinsert a new version of Tomorrow's Child, which of course was re-recorded, and bring it into that descent and combine it with the set. So you're not just going back and saying we want Tomorrow's Child exactly in the screens they had at the time. You're combining it into something new and really making a new version that sounds modern, but also still fits with the theme of the attraction. I know I'm just talking about Spaceship Earth. I'm never going to get to the rest, but also I would do some little touches, like bring back the chariot scene in Rome, though you could do it digitally or however much, just little touches like that, though I think the ascent is mostly good. I would also mix up the narration. I would have a new narrator that introduces and concludes it, but I would also bring in certain segments from Walter Cronkite, Jeremy Irons, and Judi Dench. And this would take a lot of challenges to make it all work together, but I think you do it. So in a sense, it's a tribute attraction, but you have all that together. And I'm going to stop on that now because I feel like I could talk a lot more about that and I want to save it for the future podcast. So let's move over to Imagination. Same deal. I think they could create something new that includes Figment. You bring back Dreamfinder. You focus more on imagination. You got the Imagination Institute. And also you make the attraction longer, take out what they are currently using as the ImageWorks, make the attraction. You could use the track that you have so far, but veer it off, make it more like a 10, 11-minute attraction. But also, too, I would love to see some of the style from the steampunk style that they put together in the graphic novels. Again, finding a way to pull some things from the past, a little bit from the current version, and the future. You obviously have one little spark, but you're looking at imagination now. You're using new technologies now, but you're also paying tribute to what happened in the past. I would set up the ImageWorks again upstairs. Sorry, DVC members, we can find another spot for you. I would just make the pavilion something great. And then, of course, when you look at the theater, there's two ways you could go here. I would either like to have an entirely new film focused on imagination. You could go that in 100 different ways. If Disney really wants to use IP, like your Inside Out or something, put it here, but make it something new and not a Beauty and the Beast sing-along situation. The other option I would like to see is a rotating collection of 3D films from the past, where you have Magic Journeys, Captain EO. Yeah, I understand you might not want to approach Michael Jackson at this point, but go Honey, I Shrunk the Audience, mix up all the different types of 3D movies you've done in the past. If at any point they got rid of Muppets or It's Tough to Be a Bug, you find a way to bring that in here too in some way. Make it a tribute. So that's kind of the goal across the board, is look to the past, but also to the future, and really do what Epcot Forever kind of tried to do, but in a much better way. Seas with Nemo and Friends, I would think if you want to have Nemo involved in the pavilion, that's fine. But you have to really remove a lot of that dark ride, make the views of the aquarium the centerpiece. Yes, you can have a few dark ride scenes at the beginning because they did take out some areas that were the hydrolators and everything before, but really go through and add more views of the aquarium. If they want to project Nemo and everyone into the aquarium, those are great. Let's do that. Let's project it more. We can leave a lot of the Nemo things in the actual Seabase Alpha part itself. Also, too, they need to find a better way to set up the fact that you're transitioning under the sea. Right now, doing a story of Nemo getting lost doesn't do that at all. I love the idea originally. You don't have to bring back films or anything, but just find a way to make it seem like you're going on a journey, on an adventure. You don't get that experience right now. That should be there, and it would make it so much better. Land Pavilion, the only change I would really make there is I would make Soarin' over California and Around the World as both options, because I feel like Around the World fits in Epcot, but California is so good. I want the option to do both. That also gives customization. I love living with the land. I wouldn't really make any big changes there. I haven't seen Awesome Planet, but it seems fine to have as a third thing. Moving to the other side of Future World now. Mission Space. I would not gut it and just put back Horizons. Again, I'm talking about having some budget constraints. I would make it where you actually get to play more and there's more customization, where different things actually happen on Mission Space. So yeah, maybe you're only pressing a few buttons, but what you do actually has a direct impact. There's no manual override. If you don't press anything, you're not going to crash and explode, but it's not going to go well. It's going to be a bumpier ride. Make some adjustments there. Even the current way they have it with space and then with the spinning, that's fine. Let's make adjustments that they know they can do more things. Let's make Mission Space more customizable. People are going to get more interested in it. And let's find ways to really connect it more to the love of space and get people excited about space travel. Maybe you're doing that in the post-show. Maybe there's a way that it could just be presented differently. But I feel like Mission Space does not do a great job of, it's a fun ride, but I would love it if there was more things you could do, more ways to interact with other people in your vehicle, and use that ride system to its fullest capability. Test Track, no huge updates here. I love the music. I love the futuristic view. I would work on making somehow the cars you design being more interactive and showing you what happened with those cars. Now, I know that's tough to do in the middle of a thrill ride, but find some way to take that to the next level. Things have been updated since 2012 that obviously they could make changes to make that better, but I wouldn't focus that much on Test Track. I feel like it's still a strong attraction, still a lot of fun. I would just do little tweaks to make the interactivity a bit better, but not a huge change. I might do a little more in the post-show area to make things updated there, but that is about it on that front. So, Guardians of the Galaxy, I don't really know what to do there at this point. Given that I'm starting right now, you can't just stop it. But I would find some way to make that attraction connect to Future World. If it's some minor tweaks you can do at this point in the pre-show, if it's post-show, I would also find a better way to cover that building. Now, it's gigantic. You can't just build giant trees, but you need to do something to help with the sightlines there. If it's better set decoration on it, if you have to put something around it more to make it look like Xandar, I don't know. There needs to be something to make that building look better. Right now, it's this giant monstrosity. I understand the need for thrill rides and for Guardians, but I would try to find any way to make it connect better and just ensure that the amount of money they're spending there actually works. Final thing here, I'm going to briefly talk about it. I would add one new pavilion, and I would totally replace the Play Pavilion. I understand why they need it, but it's the spot because it's, I know they've probably done some work on it, but I would pretty much gut that building and I would create something called New Horizons. Now, this is my one thing that cost a bunch of money. I suspect $100 million, whatever, but this is my fun thing where basically it's not just Horizons brought back. It's in the spirit of that. It's looking at undersea, desert, space, past of sci-fi, what we looked at in the past, what we look at in the future. If you want to throw some Disney stuff into the first part, where we're looking back at the past, do it. That's fine. Show us Star Wars. Show us even shots from Alien if they're not scary. There are ways to still put that in, but once you get to the second half, it's completely different. So I would kind of make it, again, bridging the past and the future. We're basically looking at it as, in a sense, Horizons the attraction already did that, but it fits with kind of my whole theme of Future World, where it sets kind of like what they did with originally Future World, with World of Motion, with Spaceship Earth, with Horizons. We're looking back at the past, but then we're looking to the future and making it something really special and calling out what is great and what could be great and inspiring. And the entire thing is set up, one, to have cohesiveness, but two, to inspire guests. There are ways you can both adhere to the brand and inspire guests. So that's a summary, and I know that was already pretty long, but that's a summary of what would be a full podcast. Some of it will be repetitive, but I'll get into a lot more detail and flesh it out a lot more at that time because I feel like it's pretty exciting what we could do there. All right, before I circle back to a few questions on the podcast and then close out this 100th episode, I want to answer one other question from Jason. I'll be a lot briefer, I promise. His question really narrows down to, if something came up last minute and your trip was cut down to one day at Walt Disney World, what would you do with that one day, i.e. parks, attractions, dining, etc.? This is tricky. I'm going to try and look at it just in terms of places that I think are really fun to hang out at. This is not I'm not coming back for 2 years, I got to hit every attraction. This is what would be the most fun to hang out at. And there's two things. One, I would go to Disney's Animal Kingdom. I would hang out in Pandora. I would just chill and enjoy it, get a few drinks, hang out, enjoy the atmosphere, do a few attractions, but really just spend a good portion of the day just enjoying how cool that park is. I'm assuming it's not super hot out. This is my dream. So I would go hang out there, relax, eat a good lunch, maybe go to Tiffin's and eat lunch there, or Yak and Yeti. Really enjoy it. Go to the Nomad Lounge, hang out, have a really fun day, and just chill. And then later that evening, I would go to Disney's Animal Kingdom Lodge, and I would eat at Jico or Boma. I would check out some animals before it got super dark and just hang out there in that lobby, go to the Victoria Lounge. So that was a lot of drinking, apparently. And then stay overnight, so hopefully a Savannah View room, get a really good look at animals, and just enjoy it. That, to me, sounds like a great day. I could take this in 100 different directions, but to me, I wanted to call out the Animal Kingdom and Animal Kingdom Lodge as two of my favorite hangout places at Walt Disney World. I think there's some of the best spots just to chill, just to enjoy it, and I feel like they deserve a lot more credit. And it would be hard for me to even be there for a day. I was there for basically a day or two last year and didn't go to the Animal Kingdom Lodge, but I did spend a decent amount of time in the Animal Kingdom, and I wish I'd spent a bit more there, actually. I feel like I was rushed a bit when I was there. And in hindsight, I might have just gone over to the Animal Kingdom Lodge to hang out for a short time. But there's also 25 other things I might have done in hindsight. But I think that would be a really fun day at the parks. So I have 2 questions left, both pertaining more to the podcast. And then I'm going to finish up. I want to give some shout outs to some people that I really appreciate. First of all, it's one more question for Christopher Pult. Who would be your dream guests to speak with on the show that you haven't had a chance to interview yet? All right, so we've got an hour. Let's do it. No, seriously, I'm going to try and narrow this down, but there are a lot. I'll at least kind of stick with the top. My list is very long and grows every time I read anything, basically. But 3 really stand out. If you're going to say, narrow it down to 3 people, who would be the top people you'd want to talk with? Number 1 is Joe Rohde. His info that he's been giving out on Instagram about the Animal Kingdom, the way he talks about parks, seeing him on the Imagineering Story, I just find the way that he explains theme park design and his enthusiasm to be so infectious. He'd be amazing to talk with. Of course, Tony Baxter. I've listened to all the different episodes he's done on the Season Pass. I've seen him in documentaries so much. He's always a great guest, has so much to say. I would love to speak with him. The other one is obvious too. It's Michael Eisner. Now, with all of these, I don't really expect to have a chance to talk with them. Michael Eisner, I feel like, would be the least likely that I'm able to talk with at some point in the future. I recently read his book, Work in Progress, which came out in the late 90s when he was still in charge before things kind of fell apart for him leading Disney. Fascinating book. I was surprised that he admitted some faults and some things he did incorrectly. Same with on the Imagineering Story. So I just think it'd be fascinating to talk with him, especially about when he entered Disney in the 80s, took over, and then obviously the opening of Disney MGM Studios in the Animal Kingdom and Paris and some of the changes there. I think it would be amazing. So those are the 3 big ones. Here are a few others. I would love to talk with Kevin Rafferty, whose book was really cool. Don Iwerks, son of Iwerks, wrote a book about him, also did so many things on his own. And Leslie Iwerks, his daughter, actually, who did the Imagineering Story, would be cool. I'd love to talk with Tom Fitzgerald, who I never really hear on podcasts. Every once in a while, he appears at like D23 to basically just talk about old EPCOT. I know he still does a lot, and he's way up as a leader, so he's not going to come on a podcast, but maybe down the road. Of course, Bob Gurr and Rolly Crump, who I've seen many times, and I know Rolly's health isn't so good, but it would be amazing to talk with them. Kim Irvine, I'd love to hear from. She had a big part in the Imagineering Story, which I keep referencing. I know she still works for Disney, but just given her family history and then her role at Disney, Kathy Magnum, who recently retired, would be cool to talk with given how much she was involved with there. I'd love to talk with anyone at Universal Creative, because I haven't really talked to too many people there. So it'd be great to hear from them about the development of either Harry Potter and the recent attractions, or even people that worked on Universal attractions when the park opened in Florida, or even going further back, I think would be really fun. A few more Imagineers. I'd love to speak with Eddie Sato about Main Street at Disneyland Paris and some of his other work there, or Jeff Burke. Really, I just want to talk to all the show producers for Disneyland Paris. I've talked to 2 of them already, and I'd love to talk to a few more. I'd love to talk with Brad Bird or Damon Lindelof about Tomorrowland. And obviously with both of them, I'd be tempted to want to talk about more. Like Damon Lindelof, how could you not ask him about Watchmen or The Leftovers or Lost? Same with Brad Bird's films, but zoning in, it would be amazing to talk about that film, what worked and what didn't. And I mentioned him earlier, but podcast-wise, I'd still love to talk to Pete Werner, who started the Diz Boards and the Diz Unplugged. I think he'd be fun because he's so outspoken, and just how big that's become, that would be really fun. So the other remaining question is from Jeremy Levy. Thanks, Jeremy. He said he's a new listener, and he asked me, what has been my favorite interview from the podcast? Okay, I can't just pick one, Jeremy, but I'm going to try and narrow it down to at least a smaller number. And again, I've enjoyed all of them. If I really went back and listened, I could probably name most of them as my favorites, but let's talk about some that in particular I felt like were markers, and then I may just list off a bunch that I thought were cool in various categories. Bruce Broughton was a big one for me. That was episode 33. He was the first person I talked with that had worked directly with Disney, composer of so many cool themes for movies and then at the parks, like the Energy theme, Spaceship Earth currently, Soaring Around the World, Making of Me, Cinemagique, Timekeeper, so many things. That was really fun. And it was also so easy and laid back. It made me think that maybe I could push harder and go for people that had worked there because he was so nice and so easy to talk with. On a similar note, the first person I really consider an Imagineering who I talked with is Steve Alcorn, who resurfaced for a Twitter project that's going on that's really cool, where they go through different books about his book, Building a Better Mouse. And so I talked with him on episode 43 in 2018, and that was really fun because he talked about some of the craziness with building EPCOT Center in the last few days, particularly the American Adventure. Another big one was Peggy Ferris, who I talked to in early 2019. She was just so interesting. Her whole story with like 50 years working at Disney, essentially, and her role as show producer on Spaceship Earth, learning all the research and some of the stories that went into that first version of Spaceship Earth was just so interesting. And I found just her whole path through the Disney company to just be such an interesting approach. So that was really fun for me to go through that. And of course, the most recent podcast, number 99, with Don Carson and Joe and Cicero, I found to be so interesting because you had two Imagineers that were talking about a lot more than just their stories that dug into issues and history and all of that. And I'd like to have more Imagineering roundtables like that in the future. So there's just some marker podcasts, like ones that I thought were big steps for me. But I do want to mention a few other ones here, and this is going to be a little bit like a laundry list. I'll try not to go too crazy here. I mentioned Tomorrowland. Talking to the producer of Tomorrowland, John Walker, was a big deal for me. I also love talking with Rick Harper, the director of Impressions to France, because he dug so much into that story and what it was like to make that movie. That was fascinating for me. On a similar note, Tim Delaney talking about The Living Seas and Space Mountain at Disneyland Paris was really fun for me. Some of the great storytellers that I've heard from, Mark Rhodes, just great stories about Maelstrom and so much more, and Don Carson and Joe and Cicero, who I referenced recently. Both had just such interesting stories about working on various projects like Mystic Manor for Joe or Splash Mountain for Don or so much more. I loved all the guys that talked about sound. Greg Meter was on twice, Glenn Barker and Joe Harrington. I realized quickly how little I know about sound. On a similar note, David Snyder talking about all the computer systems. That one made me feel kind of dumb, but I mean that in the best way possible. And getting away from Imagineers, I love talking to Brian J. Jones, who's an author who's written biographies of George Lucas and Jim Henson. He's been on twice. We also talked about Star Wars recently. And then some people in kind of the creative field, podcasters and bloggers. Len Testa 4 times. It's been so much fun. Tim Grassi the same way. I mentioned Ricky and Ben earlier. Lou Mangello I mentioned earlier. Doug and Brent from the Season Pass. Carly Wiesel, who was just a lot of fun more recently. And of course, AJ and Shannon, who I mentioned earlier, who do really good work running their businesses relating to Disney. And I always found that super interesting. So that's just a small bit of, like I said, those are ones that stand out to me, but there's so many more that I could just go on. And I mentioned Tom Morris earlier, another Imagineer. Talking to him about the Haunted Mansion was so much fun too. There's a lot more, and I could just keep going on, but I think that's enough to probably answer way more than Jeremy wanted to know. But if you are a new listener like Jeremy, I think there's a lot there that you might enjoy if you go back and look at some of the older episodes for sure. So I've spent a lot of time in this episode talking about myself and my show, which I don't do that often since a lot of times I'm doing interviews. So I do want to finish kind of in a different vein. I want to talk about other shows that I really enjoy and admire what they do, because I feel like there are so many good podcasts in the Disney community. You've probably heard of most of these and listen already. And just to be clear, this is not any type of rankings of the best or favorites. There are so many other shows beyond what I'm going to say here. This is just, if you see this often on Facebook or in forums where someone will say, hey, I'm new to the podcast. What kind of shows do you listen to that you would recommend, or what are some of your favorites? And this is kind of a group that I would normally list if I was going to do that, but it's hardly not a full list. So please do not take offense if I don't list your show. This is just kind of a starting point of some shows that I really enjoy and listen to regularly that I think deserve attention and likely deserve more attention for sure. So here we go. First of all, I wanted to mention WDW Radio and the 3028. Going back to when Nate Parrish and Matt were both doing WDW Radio, or now Matt is more kind of taking control and having some guests. Also, Matt and Kevin, what they do on the 3028, looking at a lot of things, what's going on right now, some fun lists, great topics, and they've been doing some really good shows recently. I just love the vibe and enthusiasm of their show, and their production values are also really good. Speaking of enthusiasm, Mike Rallman, the whole gang, Ricky and Pam on the Be Our Guest podcast, what impressed me the most about them is the longevity and the consistency. They are out there doing multiple shows, every 3 shows a week, basically, thousands of shows. As someone who's gotten to 100, I look at that and go, oh my gosh, that is something special what they're doing. They have a really strong following, and they're very positive about Disney and also have some good tips for people that are going to the parks. So that's something I'm sure you probably already listened, but if you don't, you should check out. I really like the e-ticket report, which has now basically folded up, but Chris Wakefield, Derek Bergen, and Tim Grassi did a great show. It's worth going back and hearing them talk. And then by extension, Marty Called, which Tim is doing with Skipper Ben and with Josh. I feel like I keep saying the same names, but you kind of get the types of people that I listen to a lot. On Marty Called, they're talking about the latest news, also with somewhat of a focus on Imagineering, which I think is really fun. They do about a show a month. Speaking of a monthly show, the Retro Disney World podcast, I really like what they've been doing. That show started out as being good, and they just keep getting better, and they're doing a lot of really cool stuff on their YouTube channel with Todd, Hal, Brian, and JT, and several have been on the podcast and been great guests, Brian and Hal. And I just really like, obviously it's right up my alley to look back at kind of, when they look back at Horizons, that's amazing, or Spaceship Earth or whatever, but what gets me and what I really enjoy about their show is the way that they look back at other things, at smaller things like the Wave Machine that was only in for a short time, or Christmas, or the weird TV shows, or the radio. There's just so many interesting things that they do. That's a must listen if you have any interest at all in the parks, especially the past. Whether you went at that time or not, it might actually be more interesting if you didn't go, because some of the stuff is just so nutty that I forget about, including all their looks at Communicore and some of the shows there that I didn't even remember. Those guys also, I really wish I'd been able to go to Retro Magic, which is their event they did last year. They're doing a lot of things beyond, especially now with the nonprofit Lake Buena Vista Historical Society. Really check out their YouTube channel. They have some amazing videos. They also just did a video of Horizons that is truly something special. I want to briefly mention the Disney Dish, which I think most of you know about. Len Testa and Jim Hill, really the primary source for news and also looking back at stories from the past. Jim has a lot of rumors. Some come to fruition, some don't. But I think most Disney fans that are interested in kind of what may be coming and just some interesting shows, their episodes are fairly short. This is one of those that usually comes out first when people talk about what should I listen to with podcasts. I also like with interviews, I think Dreamfinders that Nathan does is a really good show. It's through the WWNT network, but his show I think is the closest to what I'm doing. We, not planned that way. We've never actually spoken or connected at all. But I think he's had some really good guests. We've had some crossover, but then he also veers into some creative fields that I haven't really talked about, people that do things on YouTube and in other areas. So I think Nathan's doing a good show. Also, Tammy Tuckey doing the TR Talk podcast. We've had similar guests, and I feel like she always does a good job. And also, again, kind of going to types of guests like people that worked on the Barbie show or stuff that I know nothing about that I think are interesting, but also she's into music and into performers, and that's where we've had some connections there. But I think she's also a very good singer, and speaking of Retro Magic, did a really cool version. She did a short album where she did songs like Two Brothers, and they had the original singer come out, which looked super cool, and then some other songs. So you should definitely check out Tammy Tuckey's music album that she put out too, along with her show. I want to mention WDW Prep to Go, again, Shannon Albert's show, which had a lot of tips and trip reports. And what I really like is when she goes to the parks and actually would record trip reports like on a daily basis, like 6, 7, 8 minutes per day. And that's fun because it really just kind of gives you an idea of someone going through the parks. Lately, she's been doing some interviews. She talked to Carly Wiesel and AJ Wolf. people that I've talked with, and I think that's going to be interesting to see where that goes while she can't really go to the parks. I also want to mention Book of the Mouse, which is Courtney and Emily's podcast focused on Disney books. I had them on the show, which was really fun, and they've been getting really good guests lately, talking to a lot of authors. So I appreciate that because they're really zoned in. I talk to authors sometimes, but they are focused specifically on reviewing books and about people that have written things and about the parks, but also about movies and other elements of Disney. So I think that is really cool too. A couple more. I want to mention Podcast The Ride. Those guys do not need my help, but I think their show is really funny and really entertaining. They dig into old attractions and they love the parks, but I love kind of the attitude of that entire podcast, and they're rolling along. So the last thing they need is me to give them any more press, but I had to do it because they do great. Also on the Disneyland side, check out Mousetalgia, Jeff Bam, and the whole group there. They do a solid show focused on both what's going on at Disneyland now, but also history. They have some really good interviews. Several people I talked with, it was really helpful for me to listen to the interviews they'd done with them, like Glenn Barker and several others, because they did such a good job and set things up so well for when I was doing the show. I also forgot to mention earlier when I talked about inspirations, the other big one is Rob Cesternino, who does Rob as a Podcast, and he has built such a strong community there. I would not compare myself to him in any way, just because he's built such a big community around reality television. He, of course, was on Survivor. He also was nice enough to let me blog for him when I wrote about Survivor for a bunch of years, from like seasons 28 through 33, if I remember correctly. And then that's where I've been podcasting about the Raise Race Canada. So I'm thankful for that, because I also think all that writing about Survivor helped me in terms of blogging about theme parks further down the road. And I didn't mention that earlier, but mainly just because he does a really good show. He's so prolific, does so many shows, has a really strong community, has done really well on Patreon. The way he handles himself and the way he does interviews is something really cool. Finally, I wanted to give a shout out to people that have had me on the show, which is WDW Radio. Nate Parrish, when he was still running it, had me on to talk about EPCOT rumors. Ryan and Ryan at Boardwalk Talk. We also talked about EPCOT. That was really fun. Doug and Derek at Rope Drop Radio. We also talked about EPCOT. You're kind of getting the idea there. And this one hasn't even come out yet, but I wanted to give a shout out to Brett, who does Notably Disney. We talked about attraction cue music. I think that's going to be out in May. We recorded that last week, and it was really fun. So that's a lot of shout outs, but that really, as you know, is just the tip of the iceberg of great podcasts that are out there. And of course, some of the ones I mentioned earlier are still running, like the Season Pass podcast, the Diz Unplugged, WDW Radio. Those three are all still going strong. So it's fun to have ones that I've been admiring for so long that are still chugging away. And I wanted to mention that too before I finish. Well, that is going to do it for episode 100 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. If you made it all the way to the end, send out a hashtag on Twitter or other social media of Tomorrow Society 100 to show that someone got through all of this. I would love to see that. That would be really fun. Thanks for all the support during the last 5 years. It's really made a difference, and I'm super excited about where things are going in the next few years and beyond. If you'd like to support the show, you can go to tomorrowsociety.com/member to help out through Patreon. Small monthly contribution. It leads to some really cool perks. I'd love to hear what you think of the show. Send me an email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. Follow me on Twitter at TomorrowSOC, Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I will be talking with Bran Farron, the former president of research and development at Disney. This was a really fun one, dug into some attractions and just some really cool thoughts from Bran, who is an extremely smart guy. Thanks again for getting to the end of this podcast and listening to episode 100. I will talk to you again next week.